Hello, this is Dr. Derek, and this week we're studying attraction. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint slide. This video has to do with similarity in personality. I asked the question, do birds of a feather tend to flock together, or do opposites attract? And according to your book and the reading that you should have done, birds of a feather do tend to flock together. We tend to like people who share our demographics, our age, race, sex, education, religion, and social class. As an example, we've got Elsa's parents in Frozen, and we've got Anna, who is interested in Prince Hans. In this case, they're now somewhat middle-aged people. They're both white. They look strangely alike. And in this case, we have, of course, a prince and a princess. Again, they're both white. They're about the same age. So we're looking at similarity in demographics here. Even when Anna discovers that Hans is evil, she still pairs up with someone who is relatively young like her and also still white. And of course, it may be the case that people are not actually seeking out those of similar demographics. It may be the case that they just are more likely to encounter other people of similar demographics. So if, for example, you're relatively young, you're going to college, you're going to encounter more people who are very similar to you in age. In Frozen, of course, this lovely white wonderland that was Frozen 1, you pretty much couldn't pair up with someone of a different race because everyone in Frozen 1 was white. In Frozen 2, they did bring in some characters of color, and you'll notice that, of course, our one black man and our one black woman appear likely to pair up with each other. So again, the authors of Frozen, at least, Frozen 2, believe that people should pair up in terms of race. Obviously, this is not always the case, and in real life, even though people tend to pair up with those of the same race, there is considerable variability. We also tend to like people who share our attitudes and values. What are we talking about here? Well, in terms of attitudes and values, we're talking about our moral compass, the things that matter to us, the things that we care about. For example, right now, we might talk about politics. We might talk about religion. People who have similar political leanings are more likely to end up together, and people who have similar religious beliefs and similar religious practices may be more likely to end up with each other. Again, is this because we're deliberately selecting people who are similar to us in terms of these attitudes and values? Or is it that we're more likely to meet them? If, for example, you practice a particular religious faith, you may see other people who also practice that faith when you go to some form of worship. In this way, you might meet more people who have the same religious beliefs as you do. And the same thing can happen with values. There are certain types of activities that people with different beliefs tend to engage in. You could imagine two people who both enjoy doing yoga and then going out for their crunchy granola smoothie afterward may be more likely to meet each other. They may also be more likely to have somewhat liberal values versus two people who are meeting each other at the shooting range. They may be more likely to hold relatively more conservative values. So again, we tend to meet people who have the same kinds of attitudes and values as we do. And that may be part of why we tend to pair up with those people. Here we can see Anna is daring and she goes out of her way to go and help her sister Elsa. And then here's Kristoff, and he's daring and he goes out of his way to help Anna. They're two people who both value helping other people and are willing to put themselves at risk to help other people. But your book also says that people tend to pair up in terms of personality. I disagree based on my reading of the literature. This is something that you should be aware of, perhaps as we come up toward exam 1, that if there were a question about pairing up in terms of personality, you should go with what I say in lecture and not with what your book says. The literature generally shows that people do not tend to pair up with people who are similar to them at greater than chance rates once you take into account the base rates in the population. A lot of the literature that seems to show that people pair up with similar others haven't taken into account the fact that most of the things they're looking at are normative things. If you are in the middle of the distribution on something, let's say you are perfectly balanced between introversion and extroversion, your chances of finding someone who will not correlate with you are almost nil. So you will end up with someone who is within one standard deviation, maybe two standard deviations of yourself. It will be very hard to find anyone who doesn't. And that tends to be the case for many of the traits that people have looked at when looking at similarity in personality. So people don't tend to pair up with those who are similar, but if you are lucky enough to pair up with someone who is similar to you in terms of personality, you tend to be happier in your relationship. That's partly just because you understand each other better and you're less likely to encounter conflicts of interest. So if you're both extroverted, you don't have to argue about what you're going to do on a Friday night. Extroverts might both want to go out and be active with other people, and introverts might both want to stay home and sit next to each other and read books. There is this tendency for similar people to be happier in relationships. They're just less likely to encounter problematic situations. What about impulsivity? This is a relatively negative trait, whereas some of the other things that I have talked about weren't exactly value laden. Extroversion and introversion are not so strongly value laden. It's okay to be an extrovert, it's okay to be an introvert. But there's generally this assumption that people who have greater self-control are somehow better than people who have less self-control. So are they equally happy in relationships? Is it better if they match up? Do both partners need to have high self-control? Is it actually okay if both partners have high impulsivity? Is this an area where complementarity is good? If you're high in self-control, you prefer a low self-control partner? If just one partner has high self-control, is that sufficient to take care of both partners in a relationship? So as an example, we have here Claire and Phil are both impulsive. Phil generally acts without considering consequences. Claire acts rashly when angry or upset. As a couple, they experience dramatic conflicts because neither person thinks before speaking, and both are reluctant to admit fault. Research examining self-control in the context of close relationships suggests that their marriage will suffer. Yet previous research has shown that greater compatibility is associated with greater correspondence of goals and preferences. In other words, minimizing the risks inherent in their relationships. To the extent that partners who match on impulsivity are more compatible, Claire and Phil might actually experience better marital outcomes than they would if only one of them were impulsive. So in other words, this little vignette here is arguing, hey, it could be that it's necessary to have a little bit of self-control so that you don't have these conflicts and so that you don't engage in negative behaviors. But on the other hand, maybe if you're both high in impulsivity, you kind of understand each other better and you're less likely to get into conflict. We do know that greater impulsivity is typically associated with more frequent negative behavior. So people who are more impulsive are less polite, they're less forgiving, they are more likely to show extradyadic flirtation. In other words, when they're in a relationship, they're more likely to flirt with someone who's not in that relationship. They show less accommodation to their partner's negative behavior, so their partner behaves negatively and they respond the same way. They show less perspective taking, so they're not able to put themselves in their partner's shoes. They tend to have more family conflict, and they show greater intimate partner violence. According to this literature, we would argue that greater impulsivity is a bad thing, but greater impulsivity might detract from perceptions of the partner's responsiveness to one's needs. So you might have problems with perspective taking, with empathy. You might not take your partner's preferences into account. You might act in your own best self-interest instead of your partner's best interests. Impulsivity might be bad in terms of being responsive to your partner and feeling understood. Previous research has only focused on one partner. So the effects here, we might ask, are they going to be better, worse, or reversed when both partners are impulsive? We had data from 280 married or cohabiting couples. They were recruited from the community. And so they averaged in their 30s and they were a little bit older. So they're not like your typical college dating couples that you often see in social psychology research. They completed cognitive behavioral assessments of impulsivity. So that means they did some like reaction time stuff. They did some behavioral things where they had to use self-control. So things like the Stroop task. They also completed self-report questionnaires about their self-control and impulsivity, and they also completed self-report questionnaires about their relationship functioning. So people should be less happy in their relationships when one partner is impulsive than when neither partner is. But the question we're looking at here is, are people even more unhappy when both partners are impulsive, or does matching on impulsivity actually have benefits for the relationship? So here we have the outcome feeling understood, and you can see higher numbers here mean feeling more understood. So let's say I, and low in impulsivity, I feel more understood when my partner is also low in impulsivity than when my partner is high in impulsivity. So this is the typical effect that we would expect. Being impulsive is bad. But what happens if I have high impulsivity? If I am actually much more impulsive than that, would I be better off having another high impulsive partner, or would I be better off having a low impulsive partner? We found that people were happier if they were high in impulsivity if they also had a high impulsivity partner. So we got this matching effect. So at least in terms of feeling understood, people felt more understood when they matched with their partner, either both low in impulsivity or both high in impulsivity. This variable is for frequency of conflict. Higher perceptions here are greater frequency of conflict. So the lower we go here, the better. If I am relatively low in impulsivity, then I experience less frequent conflict when my partner is also low in impulsivity than when my partner is high in impulsivity. But what if I were also high in impulsivity? Would I be better off with a low or high impulsive partner? It turns out if I were high in impulsivity, I experience less frequent conflict when my partner is also high in impulsivity. So again, we get a matching effect. Either both low or both high tend to experience less frequent conflict. So finally, overall relationship satisfaction. What's best? As we would expect, when you're relatively low in impulsivity, it's better if your partner is low in impulsivity than if they're high in impulsivity. So I am happier in my relationship if my partner is also low in impulsivity. But what happens if I am high in impulsivity? Am I better off with a low or a high impulsivity partner? Well, you can see again, I am better off with a high impulsivity partner. So again, we got a matching effect. When partners are both low or both high on impulsivity, they report greater relationship satisfaction.